for coming back. We realized that all of you had to give up something to be in community with us today, and we are so happy that you did. As Donna said, this is a series of 3 webinars, and this is the second one, where today we're focusing on inquiry and self-awareness. And we are going to be using 7 artifacts from the Library of Congress. And these artifacts are aligned to current research and what it means to integrate equity in our classrooms. And today's content is really focused on us just really sharpening and deepening our sense of self-awareness and just the urgency around inquiry. So we're going to be asking you to jot down and make note of the primary source documents that are having the most impact on you, and just be thinking about what does it mean for you to show up as an ally for racial equity.
And so, Susie.
Okay, sorry about that. I get to reintroduce our colleagues here. So from upper left to right, it is Dr. Tina Curry, Felicia Chaveri, myself, Susie Evans, and Dr. Donna Keel. And we're thrilled to be back here with you again today. And let's start us out with a question. In the chat, please share your greatest fear as we approach the fall 2020 school year.
And as you're putting your comments in the chat, I thought about this question for myself. And as an educator, my biggest fear is we'll go back to same old, same old. Is that we will disregard our call to just show up differently for our students, that we will disregard the call to just change our behavior, change our conversations, change our classrooms. That's my biggest fear.
Thanks, Tina. And I think now, when we look at our fear, as we work through fear, I'd also like you in the chat to share with us what your greatest hope is for the fall of 2020. And if you haven't yet had I would encourage you all to listen to the Michelle Obama podcast, which is on Spotify. And in her second podcast, she speaks about wanting to go back to normal. And I think my greatest hope for 2020, much like Michelle Obama's, is not that we go back to normal, but that we go back to better. That when we go back in the fall, that when we have this opportunity to reunite with our students, especially whether it's remotely or in person, that it's a better opportunity, that we provide something better around racial equity, better around ourselves. I'd like to share with you just a really brief story too about our DePaul University graduates who are teachers or counselors or leaders. Most recently, they wrote a letter to our dean. And in that letter, which was compelling and very articulate, they wrote how imperative it is for DePaul to change our pre-service teacher training program and to mandate racial equity training for all of our pre-service teachers. As I read the letter, my heart was filled with pride for those graduates, but also with an urgency to get this work done. So as we start today, to welcome you, of course, and we also want to say we're going to share in that mission that our DePaul graduates call us to, and that all that's happening in our world call us to, as educators, deepen racial equity in our practice. This opening experience that we just did is also something that you can do with your students. It's the greatest way to start and transition into this new school year. Ask them what their greatest fear is as they're going forward, get it out of the way, and then also ask them what their greatest hope is. And there's a real intentionality around the sequence of this. You have to be able to acknowledge the fear in order to move to the hope. I always ask my students as well, whenever we start anything, what are you most grateful for to show up? Because that kind of thinking opens your heart space.
Okay, we're going to revisit the library's interactive primary source analysis tool again. And what a beautiful way to bring about the inquiry to drive that deeper learning. And if we look again at the 3 categories in the tool, observing, reflecting, questioning, we see a model that's going to allow us to open that door to teaching as racial equity allies. As educators, we're called to observe, reflect, and question each and every day, and we want to get our students to do the same thing. Tina?
And as we begin our time together today, we want to set the stage for a change, not just change in our classrooms, but essentially just change in our lives. And in order for us to effectively use the primary resource documents or any instructional content for that matter, we really have to open our hearts and our minds to inquiry and self-awareness around our own racial intelligence. Felicia is going to prepare us for a video that we are getting ready to watch. And as you are watching the video, just be holding on to this thing to like, what can we do to change the talk?
And as Felicia gets ready to share that, let's also, I want to acknowledge the beautiful things you've written in the chat. We share the fear that things will go back to normal when there was an almost blindness to the inequity in our classrooms. And it sounds to me like, as I glance through these, first of all, I'm edified by your passion around education and around your commitment to changing and transforming education, but we all have a hope for a better future for our students. Felicia?
Hi, everyone. We would like to share a wonderful video with you that is titled The Talk. As you watch this video, we invite you to observe your own reactions. Be aware of what emotions come up with you or come up to you, your fears, your hopes, and consider the students that you may have in your classroom or that you had in your classroom previously. Ask yourself this question: who do I teach or know who has experienced this talk? And how can I teach in ways that will eliminate this talk? Thank you.
Who said that?
The lady at the store.
That is not a compliment.
Listen, it's an ugly, nasty word, and you are going to hear it. Nothing I can do about that. But you are not going to let that word hurt you. You hear me?
There are some people who think you don't deserve the same privileges just because of what you look like. It's not fair. It's not.
Remember, you can do anything they can. The difference is you gotta work twice as hard and be twice as smart.
Come straight home after practice. You got your ID? All right. In case they stop you. How's your review?
We're good.
You good?
Yeah,
you see?
We're good.
Okay.
Good.
Now, when you get pulled over,
I'm a good driver.
baby,
Don't worry.
this is not about you getting a ticket. This is about you not coming home.
I'm gonna be okay. Right? Okay. It's not fair. But you keep showing up.
You are not pretty for a black girl. You are beautiful, period. Okay? Don't ever forget that.
Now that you've watched this video, keep in mind that it is not a radical thing to want to be seen as human. Black students are in need of anti-racist healing. White and Black teachers have a call to go back to normal in our teaching, but go back to better teaching, said by Michelle Obama. We walk into our classrooms with racist trauma. Now, we would like you to consider these vital questions. When was the first time you realized that race mattered? How was race discussed in your K through 12 experiences? How is race talked about in your schools today? And what can you do to teach as a racial equity ally? Today, in our classrooms, these are the type of questions that are important for us as educators. Here's some research that informed this webinar. 52% of the nation's students are Black and Latinos, of which 84% of the nation's teachers are white. If we are teaching as anti-racist, we are not living our purpose. If we continue to show up racially unconscious, we will continue to perpetrate that students fail because of them and not racially oppressive policies, rules, mandates, and institutions. This image from the Library of Congress can be the inquiry-driven prompt to remind us of the importance of using these primary sources to shift our teaching.
We're going to be sharing 4 teaching strategies with you and 4 ally strategies that are really centered around this concept of inquiry and self-awareness. And so these are 3 questions we really want you to hold on to sort of ground you and center you for the next 45 minutes or so, really thinking about how self-awareness and inquiry can support systemic change using the primary sources. And don't forget to make note of the primary sources that you find are having the most impact on you. We're going to return to those later on in the webinar. Right, so we will present 4 teaching strategies again and 4 ally strategies. Now, these have been specifically designed to allow us to do 3 things. They've been designed to allow us to actually use the Library of Congress primary source documents along with the analysis tool, just to do the self-awareness work we need to do to examine our beliefs about racism and equity, just to engage in racial equity practices. And this one is so important. How do we show up as educator allies for Black students?
To share with you the first teaching strategy, it is affirmative interview. During affirmation interviews, students practice verbal and nonverbal communication in the roles of interviewer and interviewee. How to have students, you will have students then create interview questions as follows. Oh boy, as follows. I'm sorry. You know what? I want you all I just have to say this. Thank you so much for being patient with me. And I know this is outside of what we have prepped for to share with you today. But taking students through the PSA tool to remind them about the importance of inquiry and self-awareness. Have students interview each other and report back to you.
The cool thing about what Felicia is describing in the interview process is that it really is about students engaging in looking at the primary source themselves after a teacher has done it.
And so why is such a strategy important? So there's a strong connection to anti-racism education. Just imagine, right? So Black students can't act on beliefs that they're not aware of and things that they don't understand. And so the affirmation interview is a great opportunity to build the kind of classrooms that all teachers wish we had. Classrooms where there is mutual respect, where they're just booming with conversations and collaboration. And we definitely want to make sure that every strategy that we give our students are strategies that empower them. And the affirmation interview is one way to do that.
So let's look at another strategy. And one of the strategies that is really powerful is the artifact add-on. You know, as teachers, we tend to want to give our students all the content and all the materials that they need to study from. But the reality is that our students are great researchers and great investigators that most naturally use inquiry to add on to what we're teaching. So in the artifact add-on strategy, what you would do is, as you set the stage for students to look at a primary source and you work them through that primary source, delving into, as we talked about last time, the reflection that comes along with examining equity and racism, that then you ask your students to select their own source that would connect to that source. And there's a great little resource that the Barra Education Foundation has supported. It's called the Primary Source Nexus. And you see a screenshot of the Nexus up on your screen. That Nexus has a collection of primary sources that are current and relevant to whatever is happening right now in our world. And is a great place. You can send students there for them to look at primary sources. But having an artifact add-on helps students then to have some type of ownership and autonomy in their lesson.
And then once students have gone through this analysis of the Library of Congress primary source documents and they've been able to gather their own artifacts, you can allow students to present their artifacts using some of these questions. You can revise these questions, you can add to these questions, but just make sure the questions are very specific to like what it is that you want to accomplish with students in this process. And it's also a really, really great way to cultivate students' agency as well.
Why would we do this? If a student is able to add his or her own artifact, it's personal, it's relevant, it's from a place from the heart. It's going to allow us to examine racism with that self-awareness and that inquiry that really allows us to get the most from that student. And again, it's a matter of agency as well.
Strategy number 3. Thank you, Susie. Every kid or every child discusses their reactions to the teacher's guided primary source analysis. There are no right or wrong answers. There is no judgment, and the power of the primary sources is able to inspire all of their thinking. That intellectual safety is vital for our students, as all of us need space that allow us to intellectually grow and expand, to take risk and make mistakes in order to evolve. Donna, in the chat, can you, in the chat, along with...
Yeah, let me elaborate a little bit. So I love the save the last word for me strategy. I use this when I was a classroom teacher a lot because it allows your students to have a discussion that everyone participates in without it feeling forced. So the reality is, you know, we have some students who tend to be hesitant to share, and we have some students who monopolize sharing, tend to be, like I tend to monopolize. I know that will surprise many of you on the screen, but I tend to be the one in charge. So what I know for sure is that now is a time when everyone needs to contribute. And so in the chat, here's what I'd love to challenge you with. Is what are additional ways we can create that intellectual safe space for our students? What are ways that you do it now in your teaching? If you could share that in the chat. And let me share with you a little story of when I was teaching and how the save the last word really transformed my use as a history teacher of primary sources. I was showing a primary source which I knew somehow was bothering a few of my African-American students. I could just tell by the look on their face. And we were doing a discussion, and my white students, of course, were talking about the injustice, and we were looking at a photograph of protests. And my Black students were exceptionally quiet. When we started the save the last word for me, it gave those Black students space. And the only prompt they had is they knew that they got to say the last word on each of whatever their thought was, so that no one would cut them off. I wouldn't cut them off. A friend wouldn't cut them off, or even another student. And so I can remember a Black student looking at the photo and saying to me, I can't even look at this photo because it disturbs me so much. And having that intellectual safe space was important. It was important for him, it was important for our class, but having a discussion where students can feel that they can go through the primary source analysis tool and do the really rigorous inquiry of, I see, I think, I wonder, and that gives them context, but then allowing them to have discussion on their own really broadens the strategy, deepens the strategy. For my white students, listening to a Black student say, I can't even talk about this, allowed them the empathy to be able to go toward racial equity. And we'll talk a lot about empathy in our next session next week, which we hope you'll come to. But giving students space where they feel safe, and space where they can have that last word where no one cuts them off. It's not a right or a wrong. There is no correct answer. It's just, what is it that you see and feel?
By saving the last word for me, students are able to first reflect on the discussion of the PSA during the class, and each person has the opportunity to share. They share what I believe, then each person shares how they feel, then each person shares what they want for the future.
Oops. Slide. Sorry.
And then the why, going back to, because there's a connection to anti-racism education, it is a really great way for students to just participate in a low stress situation. Again, I cannot talk enough about building confidence. For those of you who have ever realized that moment when you felt so confident, you know what that feels like. And Say the Last Word for me is a great way to give that to students, because learning by design is difficult, but Say the Last Word for me is a great way to again build that confidence for students.
Sounds like a song is going to break out with that, doesn't it? Our fourth strategy is brain share, and it's a combination of some oldies and goodies, that gallery walk and a jigsaw. During the brain share, small groups of students will be rotating through stations, and they're discussing and recording their ideas and concepts from the primary source analysis tool. This strategy really, if you think about it, it is the combination of both of those. And the thing that's really nice about it right now is that it can be done virtually as well as in person. So a lot of, you get a lot out of this to really get that deep reflection that we're looking for. I'm gonna have you respond to chat here for a second. Take a look at these pictures. And as you look at these primary sources, what do you see in the primary sources that convey the importance of racial equity for children? If it's one picture that jumps out at you, but take a look, give them a study. We'll give you some good time to think, and I'll be looking for those answers. What do you think? What do you see? What do you wonder?
So how do you use the brain share strategy? If you notice, we showed you 4 primary source documents we're recommending for, and it was centered around this big question of what in the primary source is evidence of the importance of racial equity for children. So you would create a question, and there would be this theme that students are to focus on. Now, we recommend that the sources that you use are sources that students have already analyzed previously together, because then what happens is then you put too much of a cognitive load on me. I'm trying to figure out on my own what these sources are, and then I'm also trying to do this other work. So it's best to do it with work that students have already analyzed together. Then they can create these groups and work together and answer follow-up questions for each of their analysis. And then the groups can rotate through the 4 sources and come back together and share.
Thanks, Tina. And you know, we'll give you a little more time now to add to the chat. And we can go back, Donna, if you can show those pictures again real quickly. Great. I saw a few coming in, and what Tina piggybacked on is perfect. So just take a little second. Deborah said power, struggle, and racism.
You know, and I think, you know, as a teacher who's often looking for ways to teach my students the power of collaboration and of listening, the brain share process really does deepen that skill. Because much like a gallery walk does, or some of the other jigsaw opportunities do, this one, though, takes it a different way to say, in a theme kind of based learning experience, what really am I experiencing, and how in my group is that different than the person next to me? It's the one way to connect white students, Black students, brown students, and other students to say, well, you see that, I see something else, in their own dialogue.
Absolutely. And you've got some really good thoughts in there too. Group thinking, how dangerous it can be. Fear, confusion, a lot of them. Yeah, it's real powerful strategy. Okay. Donna, I think we're on the why, right? There we go.
And why? Why do all of this and go through all of this? Brain sharing, it promotes an opportunity for each of our students to be included in what is taking place. Opening up classroom discussions where you are allowed to speak how you feel, what you're feeling when it comes to racial justice issues or any issues that are happening in the class where you feel something is not right. Using the primary sources from the Library of Congress, that can be used as a springboard in helping the students to learn, and educators, of course, to listen while speaking what they're feeling and connecting not only to themselves, but connecting to everyone and the world around them.
No, I'm going to do a little pop quiz before we go to the next strategies. So we gave you 4 really powerful strategies. They're inquiry-based teaching strategies to use the primary sources from the Library of Congress as powerful tools to address racial equity. And those were the affirmative interview. If you remember that, I'll just do a quick review. Affirmative interview is where students are interviewing each other with questions that the students collectively come up with. And the word affirmative is really intentional in that the students are looking to affirm each other in that interview process. Then we shared with you the artifact add-on, students adding on artifacts to something you've already shared. And you can use this cross-disciplinary. By the way, I saw Marty Block in there, who's a math whiz. And I thought, you know, the reality, Marty, you can even use this in a math class where students go out and get different sources of data and data that they find relevant as an artifact add-on. Then we shared with you Save the Last Word for Me, for you, sorry. Save the Last Word for Me as a strategy to teach where students can have their open opportunity for discussion, and then brain share, where it's a modified type of gallery walk and jigsaw where really you're using primary sources and the power of the primary source analysis tool for a follow-up discussion. So out of those 4, if you could put in the chat, which one would be a powerful practice for you? Which one of those 4, affirmative interview, artifact add-on, Save the Last Word for Me, or brain share, could help your remote teaching or your in-person teaching as you think about, as an educator who will be a racial equity ally, what might you do? Just add those to the chat as we switch now to something that's really vitally important, because none of those teaching strategies will matter if we are not allies for our students. And so as we introduce this next section, I want to share with you a little bit of a story. And sorry, team, I'm going to add a little bit. And it's a story that actually I was reminded of today during a time when I was meeting another educator. The story is around the Black Lives Matter protests. And if any of you went to the protests, as I, they're very organized by Black Lives Matter. And there's a meeting before the protest. And during that meeting, there's a great deal of scrutiny around hand signals and signs and words that have the purpose of keeping us all safe, and especially keeping safe our Black friends who are in the protest. And so there's certain key hand signals for when to say what chant and where to move and when to slow down, when to step up the pace. But then there's 2 important hand signals that I learned of. And one hand signal is for the white allies to move forward. And then there's another hand signal for the white allies to move back. And that one that's for the white allies to move forward is when our Black colleagues would be experiencing tension with perhaps the police or folks who are in opposition to the protest, is that we show that we're an ally by stepping forward. And then there are times when we as white allies need to step back. And so that other hand signal of when the Black voices need to be front and center intentionally is so significant. So as we think about those of us who are white and how we can be an ally to our Black children and to our Black friends, it's important to keep in mind when to stand up and when to move back. And so right now I'm going to move back and allow my good friend Tina to take us through the first one.
All right, so now we're going to be shifting to becoming an educator, racial equity ally. And for the purpose of our work today, we're defining ally as someone who shares power with those who don't have it. An educator ally is someone who observes what's happening around them. They can identify the problematic behavior and act on it. An educator ally is someone who supports other people in their building or just in their lives that are fighting against oppression and racism. Pretty much essentially, an educator ally is someone who empowers other people.
So why use these strategies? Where does that loving rage that we have come from, and what does it do? So I want you to think about this. What ignites our passion to do this hard work of equity in our lives and in our classrooms? Take a second. If you could add that to the chat, we'll take a look.
And while you're adding in the chat, when I think about this, I've been reading so much and I've been talking to so many people and attending so many webinars, and I think about like what those who came before me had to do, right? They were bitten by dogs, they were hosed down, they were lynched, they had to go to jail, and yet they still found a way to sustain the work because they saw hope for a better future for me. And I just feel compelled. I have to do the same thing. I have to do my part to make sure that there's hope for a brighter future for the next generation. And I think that's what gets me going.
Tina, thanks so much for sharing that. You know, I'm looking at the chat, and with the 4 strategies, I thought it was pretty neat because it seemed that there were probably, last word was probably the most, right? But all 4 of them were represented. So really neat ideas, and people even explained how exactly they would use them. So I'm starting to see this populated as well. My history and personal experiences ignite my passion. Belief in humanity. The ignorance in the world about race, especially among educators.
Great point, Yolanda.
Powerful.
There's some in the chat also, I noticed from a couple of our educator friends, there were questions about how to actually operationalize some of these strategies, how to do them. Thank you, Camille, very much a brilliant educator who joined in and helped to answer some of the questions about the affirmative interview. One thing I would like to share too is on the website, citizenu.org, we will have these strategies as handouts so that you as teachers can take them along with the primary source analysis tool and some Library of Congress resources, and you can try them out right away in your remote teaching experience. And you can also contact any of us, and we're happy to mentor and guide you. I know Dr. Curry is a brilliant educator who can help, and we've got other folks on our team, including now Camille, who can reach out and support your instruction in any way that you want. So I wanted to make sure to let you know that we've got follow-up for you.
There you go. And I'm just following that chat. It's phenomenal. Someone was talking about using the students' energy for refueling. Absolutely.
So when we think about an educator ally for racial equity, right, that's someone who has these very specific behaviors. And so we are calling the 3 pillars of being an educator ally: someone who listens deeply, someone who unites widely, and who acts boldly. And Felicia's going to talk to us a little bit more about that.
Oop, muted, Felicia. Felicia, there you go.
Sorry, forgive me. Okay, the first ally strategy is being able to listen boldly. Listening without feeling the need to answer, to save anyone, to give a solution is so, so important. Self-awareness has helped me personally, and I'm sure all of my colleagues here, to discover my greatest power as an educator. Listening boldly when our students, even our peers, come to talk to us. We can jump to a conclusion that that they want us to solve whatever their problem is, and oftentimes they really just want us to listen. Not having judgment, not placing judgment on what it is that they're speaking about, and again, not trying to solve or prescribe, but listening. To know that we hear them is generally solution enough. Listening or uniting widely, stepping outside of your comfort zone, finding the courage or the strength to meet someone across racial barriers. Look at who's in your community, who is in your close-knit groups. Invite someone that you know who you think may enjoy this or should be here to be able to learn with you as well. Sharing what you've learned from this webinar.
I think we will, in the chat, what we want to do is kind of give you an opportunity to put this into action yourself. So, the last 2 webinars have been pretty deeply vulnerable around the topic of race, and we've been very intentional about how we've been opening, hopefully, your hearts. And that can sometimes allow us the opportunity to grow even more. So in the chat, if you could put, if there is a person in your life who you could share the content of these webinars with, is there someone who you can talk about these with and really discern what we've been sharing with? Because here's what we all know as teachers. When we share what we've done, when we're teaching something, we're learning it even deeper. I always say when I'm doing professional development, the one doing the teaching is the one doing the learning. The one doing that talking is doing the learning. So the more we can share it with, the more that we can deeply embed it into who we are. So thank you, Tina, who's saying she's an adjunct at National Louis and she's going to share it with her colleagues there. I know for me, I share it with my colleagues at DePaul, and Susie's going to share it with her sister. And thank you, Jackie, for sharing it with your teacher and friends. And I love that you have accountability partners. Thank you so much. Think about someone, at least one person, you can talk about this webinar with today, so that it doesn't leave you. So that when we go back to those fears we had, that we're going to go right back to normal, to same old when school starts, that we don't let that happen because we keep the conversation going. Today, commit to keeping the conversation going.
And in addition to keeping the conversation going, it's so important that we find the courage to act boldly, that we step outside of our comfort zones, and if we're not stepping outside of our comfort zones, if we feel some sense of apprehension, it's important that we ask ourselves why. What is there something that we're afraid of? So,
and I would say too, thank you so much, Felicia. And we've got to say, what are we afraid of? But also, I'm going to challenge my white colleagues. We need to be the ones to, when we're together, stop the conversation that might not be supportive of our Black colleagues. We need to be the ones who call attention to when equity is not the centerpiece of our teaching, when we allow equity to just be the add-on. I had a recent experience when someone said to me, I just don't get it how equity is part of what you are doing with something. And I said, then that's something to pause. It's not about the methodology I'm teaching. The fact that you don't get it means that we need to explore it more, and not in an attacking kind of way, but in a way that says, let me walk with you and help you to unpack whatever bias might be in the way, whatever resistance might be in the way. So in the chat, as we move forward with this very challenging work, for all of us, but important work, can you share any time when you have acted boldly? Anytime recently when you've acted boldly? I'll share one more story and then I promise I will shut up. I have an older brother who put a post on Facebook that was not at all supportive. And I made the conscious choice to not just reply back on Facebook, but to call him and to say exactly what I thought. And it took me a long time to do that, only because I'm the one who likes to keep the peace in the family. But it was important for me, for my own integrity and for being an ally by action, to do that. So please put in the chat any time that you can share with us that you've acted boldly, because I think when we see each other act boldly, then we can do that.
So one of the most practical ways that we can act boldly when our students come back in the fall is to just simply use some of the Library of Congress primary source documents along with this primary source analysis tool, and just use it as a catalyst to just start having meaningful, courageous conversations about race. You can just start there. If nothing else, you can start there. All right, so now we're moving to ally strategy number 4, show Black students you care. In full transparency, the work of liberating our students is really centered around love. I remember when we at Good interviewed our current dean, one of the things he said at his interview is that students do not care what you know until they know that you care. And I will never forget that. And so how do we show students that we care about them? it's actually in the decisions that we make around what we put in front of them and what we ask them to do with it. It's really embedded in our actual teaching. And so you have to like pause for a second and think, okay, is what I'm showing students or presenting students showing Black people in a very positive way? Or do I just always show them as these oppressive victims of racism? Or, you know, are the boys always gangbangers and the girls are pregnant in the stories and the fathers are in jail? Are you showing Black people in a positive light? And then are you using books that are even written by Black authors? And then if you are, how are you showing the diversity that exists within the Black community, right? So just making sure we don't just stick to that one story of just the oppression, but we show Black people as the courageous, heroic, and extraordinary human beings that they really are. That's going to be really important. How and why I select text and primary sources. And so we're calling primary sources like text, because I want you to think about text as anything that you can read. And because I want to be disruptive in my teaching, how and why I choose text is not incidental. It's all deliberate, it's intentional, it's like on purpose, right? Because I don't just want to have my students to be transformed by what I teach. I want to be transformed by what I teach. What teacher does not? And so it all starts with analysis of the text that we're asking them to read and study. So does the text, is it text that's identity inspiring? Dr. Sonia Cherry Paul talks about text being identity inspiring or identity silencing. Dr. Alfred Tatum is always talking about enabling text with enabling qualities. And what he means by that, are we using text where Black students feel that what they're learning in that text can sort of like want them to be able to act on their lives and act on behalf of other people, right? So what end will this text lead? Is this text building our children's agency and leadership muscles? What end am I teaching this text? And then does the text allow for students to have dynamic conversations? That is so important, especially for Black students, because the conversations help students to feel visible. How to cultivate students' genius in your teaching. I wonder how many of you knew that students are geniuses, right? They come to us already brilliant and already bright. They're just waiting on us to get our act together. And this is one of my favorite James Baldwin's quote. He said, those who said it can't be done are usually interrupted by those doing it. So when you hear teachers saying, but my Black students can't write like that, they can't read like that. Well, Black people have been writing like that for 300 years. Yes, they can. And there's always going to be a Black student that's going to interrupt that teacher's deficit thinking by doing exactly what the teacher said they couldn't do.
So in the chat, Tina is such an inspiration, isn't she? I always am edified by how she really looks at students first, because sometimes we get caught up in the details as teachers. But in the chat, can you just share with us how you find the genius in your own students? What are things that you use now to find your students' genius? And as you're thinking about that, I have to say, I am so in awe of the way that you have acted boldly and of your honesty. Truly, all of these quotes in the chat should become visible somewhere for students to see, because the reality of your depth of love for them and your commitment to this racial equity work is edifying. And if we can give you tools to support that work, we have definitely done the work of our lives. So again, in the chat, how do you find the genius in your students? You know, and I know for me, I start to teach in a couple weeks. One of the things I do with all of my students is I have them do a biography of their learning. I want to know where they thought they were genius. And so I get to know them through their eyes first before I look at anything or judge anything or even begin to try to scrutinize who they are. Tell me who you are, and then let's go together to where you want to go. So please just put those in the chat as we move on to the Hill model, which is genius.
One of the most important books out there right now, for those of you trying to take this equity journey, is Gholdy Muhammad's book, Cultivating Genius. She studied these 19th century Black literary societies, and she took what she learned from them and created an equity framework for teaching literacies. And so she created this HEAL model: histories, identities, literacies, and liberation. So around the histories, it's like, so in this learning process, what are students learning about their identity, who they are, who they want to be, who they don't want to be, and then what are students learning, like what skill set are you cultivating in them? How are you advancing their skills? And then there's the intellect. How are you making students smarter about power, smarter about equity, justice, racism? And then the criticality, right? It's like, now how do I use my intellect and use this skill set coupled with my identity, and then I actually do something? How do I work towards anti-racism and anti-oppression? And so in the folder that we're going to provide for you, we've actually created some sample lessons using this HEAL model for different grade levels and different content areas. You still will have to just go in and still add in like what you want your assessment to be, what you want vocabulary to be, or other concepts. But here's an example of one. Let's take a 6th grade social science class. And your focus is around gentrification, right? So for the identity work, students will be thinking about just the impact of gentrification on communities of color. And then for the skill set, you want students to read and comprehend even the Library of Congress primary sources if they're available for such a topic. And then students can actually write an essay where they make an argument against gentrification. And then for the intellect, students will learn just more about the concept of gentrification and redlining. And then for the criticality, students learn about the historic conditions that even made communities susceptible to gentrification in the first place. And so that's just an example of one lesson, but you can do this across grade levels, across content areas, right? So it's so important that what we teach, right, when you think about it, students really don't need us to like teach them the content all the time. Like they need us to show them how to use what they know to make the world better. Dr. Zaretta Hammond came up with this framework called Ready for Rigor. And so she takes us through these 4 phases. So in the awareness phase is so important. So to show that you care about Black students, one of the things you have to do is like, look at your own cultural lens. Look at your own cultural lens and come to some uncomfortable truths about our cultural lens. Because sometimes it's the cultural lens that allows us to have low expectations for Black students and just totally disregard the funds of knowledge that they bring to the learning process. And then looking at learning partnerships, Dr. Kill says this all the time, that our brains are just wired for connection. Our brains are wired to be in relationship with people. So capitalize on that trust and relationship you built with students and build a partnership with them. And then information process and just understanding all the cultural ways that students come to know and learn. So you cannot ignore oral traditions and cultures when it comes to Black students. We are naturally storytellers. It is one of the way we process and understand difficult texts. And the last one, what type of community are you trying to create and build? Is it one where you show students that you care about them? Is it one where you show students that Black lives matter at school? Is it a community where students feel intellectually safe? And so I really recommend that you take a look at Zaretta Hammond's framework, Ready for Rigor framework, as a way to really help you to show you care about Black students. Doing the work. You have to seek out and listen to voices of Black and Indigenous people of color. No one, sometimes even Black educators, you cannot be an effective teacher of Black children if you do not read books written by Black and Indigenous people of color who are telling us how to get it right for our young people. Here's a list. I recommend you start with Cultivating Genius. Like I said, I don't think there's a more important book out there right now for any teacher than Cultivating Genius. The power of feedback. Seek feedback from Black students. What a revelation that would be for many of us. I have learned that if I truly want to grow, I can't just get feedback from people who lead me. If you really want to grow and find out who you really are, then you need to get feedback from people that you lead. Just ask your Black students, hey, have I created a classroom where you have felt successful? They will tell you the truth. I promise you they will. Have I created a classroom where you have felt intellectually safe? What is it like to be a Black student in my classroom? And then just really hear them and listen to them. But you want to ask students about their experiences in your classrooms if you truly want to show you care about Black children.
So in the chat, we want to know how you help your Black students experience success. Are there ways that you would share with all of us intentionally that you make sure those students in your classroom who are Black experience success. And if you don't, share that in the chat as well. We want to know where you're at so that we can too share with you any strategies that we have.
The power of educating ourselves and even educating our students just on the nature of racism. Our young people have to be educated on how to read the world and how to navigate racism, but we have to educate ourselves as well. I'm actually going to ask Dr. Kill to share a little bit about journaling with students to do some of this work.
So one of the keys to doing anything that would advance your own success and advance your own education is first to get to know who you are. What are you thinking and feeling? And the person who taught me this most deeply is Felicia on this call. During the time shortly after George Floyd's murder, Felicia sent me a text which changed my life. It's one I keep and I actually read it often. But it was in the content of the text, she talked about her own heaviness of heart of what was going on. And then we talked about that afterwards. And I said to her, what do I do? What do I do? And she said, work on yourself first. Journaling is a powerful tool to be able to uncover those thoughts, those fears, those beliefs, those resistance markers that are keeping you from being your best self. When we do that for ourselves, then we can do that for our students. One really quick strategy I used to always do in my classroom with my students is, rather than sometimes a bell ringer or anything like that, is I would ask them to just do a free write for 5 minutes. Tell me everything you're thinking, feeling. I actually did this at Sarah Good the very first time I was there in August. I said, just tell me what you're thinking and feeling now. And then I read those at our very first break. And what I read were worries about kids at home, were fears about a relationship breaking up. None of that had to do with our topic, which was understanding by design, but it was where those 80 teachers were as I tried to teach them. So when we look at educating ourselves, the most important thing is educating ourselves about who we are.
The power of being believed. Don't you remember what it felt like when you were really telling the truth and the person just did not believe you, just how painful that was? And because of the color of our skin, when you're Black, you're just not naturally seen as someone who is believable, credible, trustworthy, law-abiding. You're just not. But just the impact that has on a child not being believed. Like, children want to know that when they tell you something that you trust, that they're telling the truth, and that it's not that I'm just going to doubt your honesty and doubt your integrity. I'm just going to assume that you have integrity and that you're being honest in your words. Even when we celebrate their successes and their progress, you remember when your kid has done something so amazing, their writing improved so much you didn't even believe it was theirs. You're like, you didn't write this. No, there's no way you wrote this. Who wrote this paper for you? And the kid is sitting there going, but it's me. They're my words, my language. I wrote that. No, you didn't. Not being believed. And so that is something really important. Students want to be believed. I'm going to actually ask Donna and Felicia to share, I think, one of the most painful stories I have ever heard. And I know I just said painful, guys. Look, I'm looking out for you. I'm just trying to set you up for the hardship before they drop it on you. The stories are sad. So I'm going to ask Donna to share a story she shared with us that something happened when she was a principal.
So I was a principal for a long time in a predominantly African-American school. With my students were predominantly African-American. My faculty were predominantly white. And as principal, what you spend your day is intervening when kids are sent to your office because teachers need to have them removed from the classroom. And those of us who've been teachers, we know that the principal's office has been our salvation at times. When I can't deal with you, go there. I realized in the last year of my principalship that every time a Black boy was sent to my office, that our conversation always exactly started the same. And it was like this. I would always say, so what happened? And usually I was always flabbergasted because I knew, okay, this is going to be time consuming, because they would show up at the door and be looking down and saying, Miss So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so sent me here. And every single time, this is what they would start with. I know you're not going to believe me, but, or the other version of this, you're going to think I'm lying, but I'm not. And they're not going to tell you what really happened because you're not going to believe me. It always was that they came to me with the presumption that their white woman principal would not believe them. And just recently, I had a student who graduated when I was principal, who came back to me and called me right after George Floyd murder and said, "Ms. Keel, what are you going to do? You were the one who kept us safe. And you were the one that believed in us." And I said, the one thing I can do now is not just believe in you, but believe you. And the experience that I had when principal, when I look back and I see that my Black boys never really thought that anyone would believe them, I know what that did to them. It ripped their soul out. And I know that Felicia has a story of her own daughter that I think we can all resonate with as teachers.
Yes, and my story, my daughter was in the 6th grade, so she was 11 years old. They had a PE challenge to do as many sit-ups as they could in a minute. One of her best friends at the time was a white girl who also was a gymnast. Both of them were gymnasts. Micah, or my daughter, does the 65 push-ups, and the white friend does 70 push-ups. And when they go back to tell the PE teacher that, you know, they did it in under a minute, they give them their numbers, the PE teacher looks at my daughter and says, "No, you couldn't have done 65 push-ups in less than a minute." "No, I did. Well, he did not believe her. And through her frustration, she just decided to, of course, she's not going to be disrespectful. She gets down on the field again and she does 67 more push-ups with him watching to see that she actually did, not push-ups, but the sit-ups, to see that she actually did the sit-ups in less than a minute. To know that you have to prove yourself time and time again, that's what's really bothersome. And I never heard that story. I mean, eventually it came to me, but it was one of those things where I think with many of our children as a Black parent, they are dealing with things that they don't even bring home. And they see it sometimes as that's just the way it is. So it was very painful.
There's a way to mitigate that pain. And I believe Felicia is going to talk about building relationships with caregivers.
Absolutely. Just reflecting back on that same example, how, you know, I have to say to you, well, how, or if you would like to put in the chat, how would you have dealt with that situation? How do you reach out to the Black parents? How do you create communication? How do you connect with the Black parents of your Black students? I think it's so important. I think oftentimes we don't see Black parents as wanting to be participants in what is happening in the schools. And I was talking to a colleague recently about this, and she brought to my attention as well, the trauma oftentimes that those Black parents who have been students at schools have experienced as well. And there are times where that's where the disconnect is. So I think it's so important to build those relationships with your parents. They want to be a part of the process. They want to be involved with their children. And it's so important that we make more of a connection there. They are active and valued participants in their students' lives, or children's lives.
So just a reminder, we've showed you 4 teaching strategies: affirmative interview, add-on, save the last word for me, and brain share. Those are all inquiry-based learning strategies, teaching strategies. And then we've shown you 4 educator ally strategies of listen deeply, unite widely, act boldly, and show Black students that you care. And within that, showing Black students you care, we've given you even 5 ways to operationalize it. So I'll ask you again, this time, out of listen deeply, unite widely, act boldly, and show Black students you care, which one of those resonated with you the most? Which one do you think you could take into the classroom right away as you begin this fall, either remotely or in person? And as we close, if you recall, when we opened, Tina mentioned that we showed you 7 compelling primary source photographs. And what we'd ask now in the chat, if you look at these photographs again, here are 4 of them. I'll let you look at these, and then I'll flip to the other remaining 3. If you could just share with us which of those primary sources impacted you the most and why. What that will do for us is say, give us the seed of a future lesson. The reality is it has to speak to our teacher heart in order for us to be able to then share with our students. So here are the first 4, and then here are the other 3. So as you look at those, just put in the chat. And then on behalf of my colleagues and I, we want to thank you for today and for coming today. Next Tuesday at 3:30, we'll be on again with the very last in this 3-part series where we'll focus on empathy and the 5 levels of empathy and how to use those in your classroom, along with primary sources from the Library of Congress to be an educator who will rise for racial equity. So thank you so much. If you do have any questions, we'll hang out here in the chat for a while. So feel free to put those in the chat, but thank you so much. And thank you again to Sheila Smith and the Bear Education Foundation for all of you who showed up today, and to the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program. Thanks so much, folks.
Interesting thoughts in the chat. It's fabulous reading.
Great thought.